I may just briefly tell you about Kwela and what we do. We are essentially a leadership development organization. And in addition to leadership development, we also provide team optimization products and services to clients. And the third thing that we focus on is strategic planning facilitation. We are a small firm. We are 7 people in total, and our focus is primarily, most of our work is focused primarily in the Lower Mainland and in British Columbia. What is our focus for today? Well, I'd like to, together with you, explore how a strongly designed performance management system can create an environment where employees and individuals in your organizations are encouraged to give their best, and then also having a system and a process that can help the organization achieve its strategic outcomes. So that's the intent for the next 55 minutes. Now, this idea of having performance management enable individuals to give their best is perhaps a good segue to the concept and construct of engagement. And I want to spend a moment just reviewing what you know, what we know about engagement. Engagement has a pretty interesting definition, and it's defined in general terms as a situation when people are engaged. They tend to go the extra mile without being asked to do so. That's perhaps an attribute of engagement. Second characteristic is high levels of engagement. High levels of retention. Put another way, when people are engaged in your organizations, it's unlikely that they are looking to move elsewhere. And perhaps the third indicator of a highly engaged organization is when its employees speak very positively about the organization. So, essentially what they do is they say to others, might be friends, family members, come and join us because we have a great culture. This is a great place to work. So that's a typical definition of engagement. We very much like the Gallup organization's approach to measuring engagement, and this is referred to as the Gallup 12. And essentially, the Gallup organization says that if you and or your employees in your organization respond to these 12 questions along the lines of agree or strongly agree, then chances are that your employees are engaged. Just 12 drivers of engagement reflected in these 12 questions. And the point that I would like to make, and that needs to be made, is that a performance management system has to be aligned to these 12 drivers. You have to check these off in designing your performance management system. To what extent does the design of your system enable employees to better understand, if you look at the first question, what is expected from them at work? If you look at the third question, to what extent does your system allow people to play to their strengths and come to work to do and to be the best that they can possibly be? The fourth question, to what extent does the design of your process absolutely lend itself to very frequent recognition and appreciation? So in summary, and once again, engagement might be sort of an overall objective for a performance management system. And every component of your process has to be put in place in such a way that it enables higher levels of engagement. And these 12 questions are an illustration of the drivers of engagement. Moving along, I just at this juncture want to acknowledge that I sent you a pre-webinar article to read. It's titled The Future of Performance Management. Some of you may have got to read it. If you have done so, thank you. It's a pretty good read. If you haven't read it already, it comes to us from the McKinsey organization. And what I plan to do is make some connections between the article and some of the content that I will be covering throughout the session. Now, before I move on, I have a question for you, and if you could use attendee chat to respond to one or both of these questions. And the first question is, if you do have a performance management system currently, what are some of the opportunities and or challenges that you are faced with? If you don't have a performance management system in place, maybe the question that you can reflect on is, what is the one thing that you want to get from this webinar? The advantage or the benefit of hearing or seeing your questions at this point is I can acknowledge them and also make some links between your questions and some of the information that I hope to communicate to you during the webinar. So take a moment and please, if you could use attendee chat, I'd love to see your responses. I'm just going to allow for 1 minute of quiet time whilst you respond to these questions. Yeah, so I have a response from Rebecca. Thanks, Rebecca. And she says, sometimes it's seen by people that use it, both managers as well as employees, as a checkbox exercise. That's great. Dylan indicates that a challenge is getting buy-in from the custodians and users of the system. That's great. And a message from Krista that says how to engage employees in being more active participants in their development. I think that's excellent. Ashley's observation is, in our current system, it's an annual review. It's not completed by everyone or necessarily enforced by all levels or departments. Our opportunity is the openness of our team to completely revamp the program. One thing that I would like to get out of the webinar is to find more fluid, continuous system that is acceptable by all levels. That's great, Ashley. Thank you. Caroline says, agree with Christie's comment, engagement of employees that they have. What contribution do employees have in their success? Great. I think that's those are amazing responses. I'll move on and I'll do my very best to make some connections between your questions and what I'm about to say. So some of the typical challenges, these are meant to just augment what you've already said. Some of the typical challenges that we hear our clients touch on are the ones that you see on the slide. Sometimes we hear employees need regular feedback versus a once a year type of review. So this talks to the need that employees have for frequent feedback, also high quality feedback, and the design of systems currently or sometimes don't lend themselves to it. Second point, people are inspired and motivated by positive, constructive feedback, and the appraisal process can work against this. So for me, this word appraisal is synonymous with the actual meeting that happens between the manager and the employee. And all too often, these meetings tend to be a little bit more sort of backward focused, a little bit more evaluative in nature. And those don't work quite as well as they ought to. Third challenge that we sometimes hear about is perception of fairness. People feel fairness doesn't exist. This might be procedural fairness or fairness in terms of how compensation is allocated and applied. Two more challenges that we sometimes come across in the work that we do with clients is toughest thing in the world for managers to deal with is when they have an employee on a team that is considered as being a poor fit, and that a performance management system isn't designed to enable managers to have difficult conversations and to deal with situations like this where they are poor fit employees. And then perhaps the final challenge that we typically hear or come across is that increasingly organizations are becoming more networked in terms of the organizational structure, and the more conventional, traditional manager-employee link is not one-to-one, and an employee, well, it tends to have many peers and other managers that they have to work with in order to get things done. And this speaks to the importance of maybe a 360-degree form of feedback, and organizations look towards or look to having this objective met. In other words, how can we solicit feedback in a more networked way as compared to just relying on feedback from the manager? So purpose of these two slides is perhaps to list some typical challenges that we hear that might augment the ones that you've just touched on. Moving along, I now plan to touch on a number of best practices that we know tend to work in this area of performance management. And I want to say that best practices at best are generalized. So they generally work across different organizations and sectors. And what I would like for you to do is, when you listen to these best practices, is think about them for your specific situation, your specific organization. Now, the first best practice that we'll focus on is this one, and that is, if you currently have a system in place, assess what is currently working. This makes sense, doesn't it? Don't throw out the current strengths and the current features of the system that you have in place that is working. But also the converse applies here. Also assess what is not working. We worked with a client a little while ago who had a performance management system in place. And what we decided to do is administer a very simple survey aimed at the managers in the organization. And one of the questions that we asked is this closed-ended question. and that was to what extent is your current process working? And you can see the results in the schematic, the pie diagram. You can see from this result, 22% of the manager respondents said they really felt that the current system is effective and works, which underscores the point that I made earlier, and that is focus on things that are working and find ways to amplify and to accentuate them. But then if you look at the red sliver in that pie diagram, as many as 28% felt that the current system is ineffective or was ineffective. And then the largest response rate was in the category of average. So as many as 50% of the respondents felt that a nebulous sort of average response to the question. Now, we also asked some open-ended questions where we invited verbatim responses. And some of the things that we learned from looking at the comments was the respondents felt that the fact that there's a structured approach where once a year they are expected to provide feedback and have a discussion with employees. Almost always that is a strength of the system. There is some obligation, there is some structure, there is an expectation for conversation to happen, is often seen as a good thing. In this particular instance, what we learned was that what was not working was the form was seen as being unnecessarily complex and not easy to work with. Other thing we learned was that in many ways it was a cut and paste exercise. In other words, managers would cut and paste comments and observations from previous forms, which correlates to a comment that one of you made earlier about it being as a checkbox type of exercise. And the other thing that we learned from the survey was that there was an expectation that a review happens once a year, and it was seen by the managers as not being frequent enough. So the advantage of doing work along these lines is you have data, survey data, and it informs the design of your process. Accentuate things that are working and then focus on the constraints, and how can you design a process that will help you overcome the identified obstacles. Second best practice to share with you is this idea that your performance management system must allow for goals and commitments to change as organizational and team priorities shift. Now, this is going to happen, right? All our clients, most of the organizations that we work with, and I'm sure your organization is no exception, constantly having to respond to environmental and business changes. So change is a constant, and this almost always manifests in changes in team objectives as well as individual objectives. It therefore makes sense that the design of your system is flexible enough to accommodate these changes. We had a client about 12 months ago based on the island, where we in the form, in the design of the process, there was a question that every time the manager and the employee met, they were encouraged to discuss these questions. And the questions were, have your performance goals changed? Do they still make sense? Second question was, if not, why? In other words, what's the rationale? Why have your goals changed? And the third question that they were encouraged to discuss together was and is, do revision updates or additions need to be made? I might also share with you in the area of goal setting some new developments and maybe best practices, is to find a way in performance management discussions to allow not only for conversation around goal setting and prioritization, but also to create an opportunity for managers and in turn employees to talk about context, broader context. In other words, hey, this is a great opportunity for me, a manager might say, to tell you about some interesting strategic developments that are happening in our department, some bigger picture stuff. And this is what it means for our team. This is what it might mean for you. What are your thoughts? What are your questions? So this is absolutely a wonderful opportunity to use goal setting to talk about the bigger picture. Second development that we are seeing in the area of goal setting is to consider how to set at least one goal or to set a priority related to the strength of the employee. So this idea of focusing on what comes naturally, focusing on things that energize employees in their jobs, and developing commitments or a developmental goal that play to the strength of the employee. So the question is, how might you design your system, your forms and so on, that play to the strength of employees? Moving along then to the third best practice, and this is a bit provocative, isn't it? And that is, we have a point of view, a very firm point of view, that organizations should be moving away from ratings. Now, this is provocative, and that's because the majority of organizations still have performance management systems with rating scales. In fact, I came across a very recent piece of statistic, some information embedded in the Canadian HR Reporter, the September 2018 publication. They surveyed 324 employees in Canada, and what they found was that 85% of employees are still using rating systems. In other words, the vast majority are still using rating systems. However, listen to this, this is down from 94% in 2011. So they had a benchmark, 2011, and as many as 94% of organizations were using ratings at that point, and in 2018 that had come down to 85%. Now let me tell you the reason why so many organizations, in my opinion, still hang on to ratings is because it's still an efficient way to determine compensation increases. And I think that needs to be acknowledged and worked with. I think another reason why organizations still use ratings is that it's a tough sell to senior management, to have them buy into move away from ratings, not only because of compensation reasons. I feel that many senior people are highly analytical in terms of their thinking, and ratings gives them a sense of feeling that the process is somewhat objective. The biggest constraint and obstacle to having ratings, of course, is that it's a labeling process. What managers are forced to do is place their employees into categories, and almost always there is pushback from employees when they are placed in a category or given a label. And this is, of course, because behavior is so darn complex and it doesn't lend itself to placing an individual into a category. And all too often, this can lead to disagreement. It can lead to conflict, which detracts from what we are trying to achieve with performance management. And that is, highly engaged, highly motivated employees. So you might be thinking now, Nic, if you are advocating a no rating approach, what is the alternative? Well, the alternative is quite simply using words, using a summary to describe the performance, the achievements, the strengths and developmental areas of our employees. So writing things down, using language, using words in describing performance is a very strong alternative to using ratings. A subsequent question that you might have for me is, but then how do we figure out compensation? Legitimate question. And what I'd like to do is just put that on the parking lot for a few moments, and I'll come to it in a little while. Please, at this point, or at any point, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them. So next best practice is designing a holistic approach where there's not only the biannual structured and formal review, but where managers are providing very frequent recognition, feedback, and coaching. Now, we know that this is desirable. It's important for motivation and engagement. We all know this, but it's tough to do. My question to you is, what gets in the way? Put another way, why? Why is it so tough for us in organizations to create a culture where ongoing, both positive feedback as well as constructive feedback is difficult to do? Would love to hear from you. There's going to be a minute of quiet time as I give you an opportunity, please, to use attendee chat to send me your comments and observations. Just 15 more seconds, please. If you do have any observations, we'd love to hear from you. Why is it so tough? What are some of the obstacles? Thank you so much. So let me do a review of some of these responses with you, if I may. We have Ashley. Let me start with Caroline. She says, time is the biggest challenge, uninterrupted and focused time. Ashley says the same thing, time constraints, proper channels to provide feedback. Krista, same thing, a bit of a trend developing here around time. Many people don't feel comfortable. This is good. Jenna, giving constructive feedback. And what people struggle with, Jenna is saying, is they're not clear enough in providing clear expectations and feedback. Rebecca says time, lack of confidence. Thank you, everyone. I think you've absolutely hit the nail on the head with your comments. Those are some of the typical obstacles. So one of the ways to deal with the time obstacle is to show managers and indeed employees that it need not be time consuming. So I think of this lovely story that comes to us from a reporter who was interviewing Jeff Emmett, who is this dude who, until quite recently, was the CEO, president, as well as chair of General Electric. And the reporter, I'm sorry, I just a distraction here. I'm distracted, forgive me. Rebecca indicated that she's not connected by phone anymore and can't hear me. Just to check with the rest of you, can the rest of you hear me? And maybe you could just use your icons, the smiley faces. Oh, thank you. Rebecca's back in the webinar. She can now hear me. Great. Thank you, everybody. And forgive me. So Jeff Emmett, the reporter, said, hey, Jeff, you sort of got a pretty big job. You have captains of industry reporting to you. How on earth do you find time to give feedback and do coaching and to do performance check-ins and so on? And he thought about that question for a moment. And his response was, I do performance check-ins, I do coaching every time I'm with one of my direct reports. So what Jeff was saying is that a level of awareness exists for him, a level of consciousness along the lines of, I'm with somebody right now, maybe I'm in this individual's office, or she's in my office, or maybe we are walking together to a meeting. And this is an opportunity for me. Is it an opportunity for me to provide some context? Is this an opportunity for me to provide some appreciation and recognition? Is this an opportunity for me to provide some critical feedback or some advice or some coaching? So when managers begin to understand and see that getting to performance management practices on a day-to-day basis, week-by-week basis, month-by-month basis, rather than waiting for the 6-monthly check-in, the more they realize that it need not be an extra burden or responsibility. And they can do it as part of a day-to-day type of existence. And indeed, another benefit is that the review conversations then can be shorter, actually, can be maybe 30 minutes in duration, 45 minutes in duration, because they become summations and summaries as compared to taking much longer. Now, the other thing I might mention is that constructive feedback gets a bad rap. Have a look at this. You'll see that this comes to us from Gallup again, 2009. They did a survey amongst a whole bunch of North American leaders and managers and employees, and they said, hey, to what extent does your supervisor, your manager at the bottom of that schematic focus primarily on your strengths? And you can see 37% of the respondents said yes. And then they said, hey, how many of your supervisors focus on weaknesses? And you can see the response. How many of your supervisors do neither? In other words, just ignore you, don't provide you with any feedback whatsoever. You can see at the top of the slide, the legend, percentage of the respondents that were engaged, the beige color, not engaged, and red, actively disengaged. Let's have a look at the results together. So you can see from the first column, 61% felt that their managers focused on strengths and were engaged. 38% said, yes, focused on strengths, but I'm actually not engaged. So 2 takeaways from this data for me. The first one is a strength-based approach to leading others, managing others, absolutely has a place, but it's not the panacea or the silver bullet. There's other things that one needs to do. Second takeaway is that people would much rather be given tough feedback, constructive feedback, as compared to getting no feedback whatsoever. So this brings me back to where I started, and that is that feedback, constructive feedback, when done well, is an absolute gift. It really is. And employees actually want it. They really do. To be able to create this belief system, this understanding, this conviction amongst managers that constructive feedback is actually a wonderfully enabling thing is part of the solution. And then, of course, providing them with the wherewithal in terms of the skills to be able to have difficult conversations and to enable them to feel more confident in giving constructive feedback is part of the strategy for sure. So moving along then to the next practice, and that is this idea of focusing on the future. We have a current client. We've just designed a performance management process for them. And in fact, they are currently doing performance reviews, and their deadline is to do their reviews before the end of March. Their performance management form comprises 7 sections. Every section has a question. The focus is on a question that needs to be dialogued and discussed between manager and employee. Let me tell you, 6 out of the 7 sections focus on the future. For example, there's a question about where are we going? So this is an opportunity for the manager to go first and talk, and what the manager does is talk about context, the point that I made earlier. Because it's dialogue, the employee is encouraged to respond to the question. Second section in the process is the question that needs to be discussed. Where are you going? The employee begins answering this question by talking about their role and what's working, what's not working, and maybe a responsibility or an area that they want more exposure to. Third section in the process is the question, what is going well? This is the recognition question. Remember, this is two-way communication. So the supervisor goes first and answers the question. This is what I think is going well for you as a team member. The employee answers the question. So can you see, and in summary, 7 sections in this client case study, 6 sections focus on the future. 1 section focuses on the past. And this is the section where there's a review on the 5 or 6, typically between 4 and 6 goals or commitments that were arrived at during the previous review period. Why focus on the future? Well, it's a decidedly more positive type of experience, isn't it, for both manager and employee? Moving along to the next best practice. Remember, at the beginning of the webinar, I said one of the challenges that employers or organizations are faced with is increasingly traditional hierarchies are being substituted for networked type of structures. And employees can benefit from getting feedback from others. Now, what I'm recommending here is not a 360 type of system. 360s have a place. Forgive me. And indeed, we use 360-degree feedback in our leadership development programs. But we seldom use a 360 approach for performance management. And that's because to do it every 6 months or annually and to use a piece of software is a very time-consuming process, can be expensive to implement, and invariably there's pushback to using 360s during performance management. What is the alternative? Well, what we recommend is that very simple process, very simple step, where if the manager and the employee believe that the employee can benefit from getting feedback from somebody else, maybe this employee served on a project team or a work group for 4 months, and the project manager can provide this individual with some feedback that can be incorporated into the review process. Both parties agree, the manager and the team member. Simple process of the team member sending an email or a little template to the project manager, where the project manager is encouraged to respond to 2 prompts. And that is, first prompt is my strengths are ... complete that prompt. In other words, please give me feedback on what you believe my strengths are. And then the second question is, please suggest one thing that I can get better at. So the project manager in this hypothetical situation will respond to those 2 questions or prompts, and both the manager and the employee will have received quick, spontaneous, easily accessed feedback that can serve as input into the review. I hope that makes sense. Moving along to the next point. So I suspect this is a question that you have. If there are no ratings, how on earth do we determine compensation? Well, the answer to that is having review meetings or manager meetings where managers come together. If you have a very large organization, this can be sort of sliced and diced based on a division or business unit or department, depending on your numbers. But essentially the concept is managers get together where they talk about their people, and they absolutely talk about performance. They also talk about how people on their teams are living up to organizational values, extent to which there's culture fit. And very importantly, during these meetings, there's calibration. In other words, the managers are comparing employees across the organization. So if there's an engineer on a particular team, this individual maybe has a similar job with engineer in a different part of the organization. And these 2 individuals, their performance over the last 12 months are being compared against each other. Individuals are spoken about, calibration is happening. And it's those 3 or 4 inputs that are used to make decisions about compensation. So the point to make here is it's okay to differentiate people in your organization. It's actually okay to rank people in your organization. It's actually okay to provide them with ratings, but you don't do it as part of your performance management system and process. In other words, it should ideally happen behind the scenes, and you would not necessarily share the rankings and ratings with your employees. But what you do need to do is you need to explain to them, they need to understand, and there needs to be some transparency in this regard, how compensation works in your organization. And essentially, managers need to be equipped with those speaking points. We get together and we talk about employees across the organization. We talk about performance, because performance is important. We talk about cultural fit, adherence to values, and we use these inputs in deciding on an increase for each individual. Now, I want to preface what I say by saying that we are not compensation experts, but I'm pretty convinced that this concept works, and indeed it's a concept that we advocate and highly recommend organizations work with. And you would absolutely, if you decide to implement a process like this, you would obviously want to get some input from your compensation experts and people. Then I'm almost done in terms of the review of best practices, and we have 11 minutes left in the webinar. Hey, I just want to show you this information. So this is from the survey that I referred to earlier, where we surveyed these managers in this client organization in terms of the strength of their performance management system. One of the questions we asked was, do you believe that there should be a link between performance and financial rewards? And you can see overwhelmingly people said yes. So I think as a generalization, there should be a link between performance and compensation. People want this in general. And we believe it should be, the connection though, there should be a disconnect, as I mentioned earlier, between the performance management system and allocation of compensation. Maybe, I believe this is the last best practice. Please roll out your performance management system, and this might be a refreshed system or an improved system. Roll it out with great training, where the focus is not only on skills, training skills and so on, but also where you are focused on influencing mindsets and belief systems, primarily your managers, around, hey, we do this. The business case is engagement. We do this because it's the right thing to do in terms of having highly motivated people in our organization. We do this because it's not necessarily an added burden for you. You could get to this in the moment. And we do this because it's an important part of your job as a people manager. So the training should focus not only on skills, but also belief systems and attitudes. I want to show you this organization that's currently doing their review. Remember, I mentioned they have to do it before the end of March. What you see here is feedback from the training that we did. 3 sessions for employees. This is just an employee perspective, not a manager perspective. Y-axis is number of responses The x-axis is the extent to which the training and the system that was unrolled meets people's expectations. Average score here, as you can see, is I believe it's 6.4 out of 7. And I can tell you that the manager feedback is even higher. So you can see from the schematic that it is possible to put people in the room. These training sessions lasted for 2 hours, and both employees and managers got a lot out of it. So I'm going to begin concluding now by saying, once again, what is the case? What is the business case for linking performance management to engagement? And when we have highly engaged cultures, Gallup organization shows these results. It actually has an impact on the bottom line. I like the statistic because it suggests it's not everything. 83 chance of achieving above average business performance. And then 17%, lowest levels, only a 17% chance. So what this suggests is it's not the panacea, it's not everything, but absolutely engagement is a very big variable. In summary then, here are the best practices that we dealt with. I'll summarize them very quickly. Assess what's currently working, what's not working, and build onto this data. Number 2, make sure that your goals can shift throughout the year. Strongly believe moving away from ratings is a trend. Building a culture of coaching and feedback and doing this in the moment is the way to go. Design your process, number 5, in a way where there's a focus on the future. Number 6, have a mechanism to elicit feedback and obtain feedback from others. It's still possible to reward high performance. It's still possible to make a meal and acknowledge people that are going the extra mile, but it's important to disconnect performance reviews from compensation. And then finally, don't underestimate the importance of a great rollout in terms of training. With that, I want to ask what questions you have, and we have a few moments for questions. And as you are thinking about questions, I want to go back to where we started, and that is some of the questions that you asked at the beginning of this session. So Dylan had a point about owner buy-in, and I hope I've shown you that you've got to focus on results. Find answers to this question: why are we doing this? And I believe that you've got to make a link to engagement and some of the results that I showed you earlier. Let me try and deal with some of the other questions. Rebecca, your question about a checkbox exercise. I hope I've shown you that if it's embedded in your culture, people begin to believe deep down that this is about engagement as compared to just completing checkboxes. Krista had a very good question about how can you show employees that they have a role in this process. I believe training is part of that solution, and to show them and create some clear expectations around what they could be doing to contribute positively to the performance reviews and associated conversation. And then there were a number of questions about people not feeling comfortable about giving feedback. Again, I think it's about belief systems and also providing some training to, we have a simple little formula. It's called DEAR. We believe that if DEAR is implemented well, it's a great way of having a tough and difficult conversation with somebody, with a team member. So I hope I've answered some of the questions from before. There was also a question about how can we ensure that it's done consistently throughout the organization. Well, I think the answer to that is I believe it needs to be mandatory. Something along the lines of absolutely expect you to have 2 formal structured check-ins once every 6 months. And then in addition to that, frequent recognition, feedback, and coaching. So I think making that mandatory once buy-in and ownership has been achieved has a place. And then once again, this idea of shifting belief systems and mindsets. We just have a few more minutes left. Are there any remaining questions from any of you? We'd be very happy to answer maybe one final question that one of you has. Thank you. Thank you. I see some what's this called? Thumbs up. And I do hope that you've enjoyed the session. Thank you so much for choosing to attend it. I've enjoyed it. And if you have any feedback, I believe any meeting has a little mechanism. In fact, you'll see an email in your inbox where you are encouraged to give some quick feedback. If you are open to doing so, that would be wonderful. Thank you, everybody. All the very best. You have my email address. If you have any questions for me after this webinar, please feel free to reach out and send me an email. Thank you once again, and all the very best. Enjoy this beautiful weather.